The Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer and Prince William are among those gathering in Belém in northern Brazil ahead of the UN climate conference next week. The gateway city to the Brazilian Amazon is hosting what's being dubbed the Forest COP. Well, it takes place a decade after the Paris Climate Agreement, in which countries pledged to try and restrict the rise in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees. Well, a recent UN report warned that governments are falling short of those promises made. The UN chief said this year's meetings must end with a credible plan. Well, Brazil hopes that the location of this year's meeting will highlight the importance of protecting the environment and its ecosystems. But there are some key countries who won't be attending this time. Big economies and big polluters: China, India and the United States. Well, our climate editor Justin Rowlatt reports.
The fight against climate change has come to the edge of the Amazon rainforest itself, but at a time when faith in the international climate process is faltering. They're still building the massive conference centre that will host this summit. The official opening is on Monday. Only a couple of dozen world leaders are expected here in Brazil for what is in effect the grand opening of this conference. The leaders of China, India and the US, together responsible for roughly half of world emissions, will not be present. The US is withdrawing from the Paris Agreement entirely, and the UN has conceded that the latest round of carbon-cutting commitments made by the countries of the world fall short. It is not an auspicious background for this summit.
Current commitments still point to climate breakdown. Scientists tell us that a temporary overshoot above 1.5 degrees is now inevitable, starting at the latest in the early 2030s. And the path to a livable future gets steeper by the day.
Yet there are glimmers of progress. Renewable energy technologies are being deployed around the world far faster than was anticipated a decade ago, and the global rise in CO2 emissions has nearly levelled off. However, these advances have been driven more by market forces than by the Paris Agreement. So whether this vast conference in Brazil can help restore confidence in the UN climate process remains an open question. Justin Rowlatt, BBC News, Belém.
Well, let's speak to Nigel Toppin, a former UN climate change high-level champion from the COP26 presidency and, more crucially, the current chair of the UK's Climate Change Committee. Welcome to BBC News. We talk about these meetings every year, and what's quite startling is if we look 10 years on from Paris, agreements and targets haven't been met, have they? What hope do you have of this year's summit actually achieving, as the UN wants, credible goals?
Well, I think I challenge the assertion that the process is not working and nothing has been met. I mean, we were on a trajectory for significantly north of 4 degrees before Paris, so the curve's been bent, but not enough, and we're going to overshoot 1.5 degrees. It's a ratchet process, and every 5 years countries have to come back with new plans, and we are seeing more ambition. The Chinese plan is significantly more ambitious now. For the first time, we'll see them commit to reduce their emissions in absolute terms, and they've always over-delivered on there. So I think what this COP is really going to be about is moving on from the negotiation phase to moving into the implementation phase, what we call the action agenda. And as many ministers and mayors and CEOs and financiers here in Brazil looking at what actually has to happen to accelerate renewable energy, electric vehicles, clean industry, and our food and land contribution to climate change. So
You talk about
the real emphasis is on action.
You talk about what needs to happen, Nigel, but you can't help but notice the fact that three massive economies, massive polluters as well, who are at the heart of these discussions, aren't showing up this year. The US, India and China, who you mentioned just then.
Well, I think it's not true that they're not showing up. I think that we're talking about the leaders, some of the heads of state. Of course, the USA are withdrawing from Paris, which is the Paris Agreement, which is not good, but the Indian and the Chinese delegation will be here.
But the leaders aren't there. I mean, it's a sign of a lack of kind of commitment, in the sense that we have seen the leaders attend previous COPs, haven't we?
Yeah, I think you'd prefer to see a stronger turnout, but I think I always like to look at what's really happening on the ground in the economy, and both China and India are accelerating their investment in renewable energy at a pace and shifting quickly towards electric vehicles, two big sectors that are really driving down demand for fossil fuels in the future.
And just very briefly, if I can, what are the main themes that you hope will dominate this year's summit? Talk about electric vehicles. There's also, of course, about ensuring that countries that are impacted the hardest get money to support rehabilitation after these climate disasters. These things come up every year, loss and damage funds. What do you want to be at the heart of this year's agenda?
Well, finance is always at the heart, and there are real headwinds there, but there's some quite creative new instruments being developed and launched to provide finance for countries who are looking after standing forests. I think there will be a big emphasis on adaptation, really with the emphasis on how investment needs to flow to make economies develop in a more resilient way, and then a lot of emphasis on nature, how we pay for the restoration of degraded lands and to transition towards regenerative agriculture, a big focus of the Brazilian COP.
OK, Nigel Toppin, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts ahead of those meetings. Of course, let's see what comes out of them next week.